Hello, gentlemen. My name is Paul Robson. I'm the founder of Manifesto, and this is going to be an overview of contemplative traditions for a person who has been engaging as wanting to go deeper with a contemplative or meditative practice of getting to know yourself and existence. So, in Manifesto, we have 10 principles, and principle number 1 is called Know Thyself. And what we mean with that is that any person who wants to become a better person, to be more effective in the world, and be able to understand reality better, needs to engage in a regular practice of contemplation or meditation. And what we found is that as people do that, then it becomes increasingly important to understand the various traditions and approaches to meditation that exist out there. And so that's what I'm going to be doing with this presentation. I prepared some slides here, which you can see here. It is about contemplative traditions. And first thing I need to underline is that I have a broad experience with all kinds of traditions, but you cannot ever say that you can stand outside of tradition and look at them objectively. We're always going to be within some kind of tradition. So I'm not going to try and pretend that I'm giving a neutral presentation here. Instead, I have a table here that I'm going to be looking at these, and I spent the large majority of my life within the secular framework. I grew up in a conservative Christian home, but very early on as a teenager, I rejected Christianity, and I spent most of my life there until I kind of reached a place where I realized that I needed to find something deeper and more meaningful in my life than what the secular worldview presented to me. So I went and explored various Eastern traditions and as well as several New Age movements, and then eventually landed back in today I'm an Orthodox Christian. And so I'm going to be looking at what I've understood and also spoken to people from these various traditions from this table that I have here, where you can see, first of all, we're going to talk about what is it that each tradition rests upon as its foundation. What is it that you're putting your faith into? Next, we will take a look at the epistemology, which is describing how do you know what exists in reality? Where does that come from? Knowledge of what exists. We'll talk about cosmology, which is what is the universe? What is it that actually the universe consists of? Where does it come from? We will next talk about anthropology, which is what is man? And then lastly, we'll talk about values for each of these individual approaches. So which is what is the good, and also if in some cases, what is evil then as well. So first of all, looking at the secular tradition, then what we have here is the foundation of the secular tradition is, of course, science. Science is a really good brand these days. Science is, of course, focused on the material world. It is through testing and experimenting and being able to record what we can with our senses. So this is what we know exists, is that which we can detect with our senses as well. So it's very much focused on looking at the material world. Of course, the scientific method is a fairly new thing, but it's become very, very popular, especially since the Enlightenment period. The cosmology of science and the secular worldview is that the universe consists of matter and energy. If you look at a kind of a deeper understanding of that, then there's also something called dark matter and dark energy, which constitutes actually something like, I think, about 83% of the universe, according to science. And we don't really know much about what that is. So there's also a large aspect where science is quite realistic about its own limitations and realizes, that one thing we know about science is that it goes through these paradigm shifts where whatever it is that we believe about reality today, 100 years from now, within the scientific paradigm, we're probably going to look back at it and think it's a little silly, the way that we look at the science of 100 years ago. And thought like, oh, there were some pretty weird things that we believed there, or some incorrect things that we believed there as well. So sometimes there are smaller paradigm shifts in science, and sometimes there are larger paradigm shifts. According to science, man is a product of evolution. Man is simply another animal. There are many scientific attempts to try and show, it's quite apparent to us that there are differences between humans and animals. But I think one of the difficulties here is this next column that I have on this table here, which is about values, because it's quite clear to us that values mainly apply to human beings. And science, of course, has to remain value-free. That is part of the scientific method, is that that science has to try and be completely neutral as far as like good and evil or something like that. That doesn't enter into the scientific paradigm. Science attempts to describe what is instead of what should be. And so the moment that, and you've seen sometimes where science starts to become infected by a specific set of values, often from an ideology of some kind, and this often skews science. So science, and I'm a big believer in science, should be value-free. I believe that science is best when it's value-free. But it also then, of course, has a hard time explaining why is it that man has these specific values that we orientate with. Why is it that, for example, a lion can go and kill other lions or even human beings, and it's not seen as a bad thing for that lion to do that? It's just a part of its nature, while for humans, obviously, we see something completely differently. So I won't go too much into that yet, but that's some of the limitations of science, of course. The next step we have here is the Christian approach to contemplation. Christianity is founded on the person of Jesus Christ, who is seen as the God-man in Christianity. So he is fully God and fully human. He brings together kind of the highest of the high and the lowest of the low into one hypostasis or one person. The knowledge of what exists in Christianity comes through revelation. So this is the idea that we don't know where our thoughts come from. Also in science, understanding the process of thoughts is very difficult to understand. There's been lots of different ideas about kind of the collective unconsciousness and stuff like this. But in Christianity, then knowledge of existence actually comes through revelation. Cosmology based questions about what is the universe. Well, the universe consists of heaven and earth. And I think that is seen in a kind of concrete, physical way, but especially in a kind of experiential or phenomenological approach. But it's also seen as a very symbolic aspect of that. The universe kind of has and in some ways the earth represents body, and the heaven it represents the world of ideas or mind or something like that. Man is, in the Christian worldview, an icon of God. So he is created in the likeness and image of God. He is created by God to be reunited with God. And so there is a mystical aspect to man. It's far more than just a kind of a down-to-earth physical animalistic approach. And there's quite a large difference between man and animal in the Christian worldview. And then lastly, the question of values is that God is seen as the ultimate determiner of what is good and what is evil. And everything is measured up against God. And of course, what we know about God in the Christian worldview is that there are two different approaches to understanding God. That's called the apophatic and the kakophatic understanding of God. Apophatic means that you can only say what God is not. So whatever you say, God is this or God is that, then he's also not those things. And so the kakophatic is defining God's attributes. So these kind of two approaches go hand in hand, because at the end of the day, as soon as we talk about, and I think any spiritual tradition will recognize, as soon as you talk about the transcendence, then words fail us. And so whatever definition we try and put onto something like God will always turn out to be too low, or words just aren't able to encapsulate something like that. So God is that which is outside of our human understanding and breaks all the categories as well. But the person of Jesus Christ, of course, is what everything we know about God, we know through Christ in the Christian understanding. Next, we have the Eastern approach to contemplation. And there, our foundation, of course, is with the Buddha. The Buddha lived some 400 years before Christ in India. There's a story, just as the story of Christ, we have a story of the Buddha and the process that he went through before having some realizations about the nature of himself, the nature of reality, that then led to the entire tradition of Buddhism. The knowledge of what exists comes through the transformation of consciousness for the Buddha. So it's about having these most fundamental insights of what oneself is and what reality is about that determines how we can come to a knowledge of what exists. And it's a very different image of what exists compared to the Christian worldview as well, because the cosmology of Buddhism is this wheel of samsara, which is basically going from, we have what's called the God realm, the jealous God's realm, the human realm, the animal realm, and the hell realm. And basically existence just goes through these kind of different realms of existence. And they're all really just illusion. That's the whole idea behind the wheel of samsara, is that the reality as we humans experience it is really just an illusion. And so this transformation of consciousness is about seeing these different realms for what they are. It's just this wheel that's going around and around and around. And of course, the idea is that you want to transcend it by getting out of it as well. So what is man? Well, the man is defined by what's called the 5 skandhas. The 5 skandha, it means like the 5 heaps or 5 piles or groupings or something like that, which basically, I think, defines, the way I understand it, is the things that humans cling onto, which are the cause of suffering, of course. So what man is defined by how he self-inflicts suffering on himself. And these 5 gatherings is form, sensations, perceptions, mental activity or formations, and last of all, consciousness. And so there's very little, as far as I can understand it, concrete physical reality out there, as opposed to Christianity, which, again, Jesus Christ was fully God, but also fully human being with a physical body. And so the whole of creation and our whole understanding of reality is brought together in Buddhism, and we'll get a little bit more into this later on, is there's much more focus on the transcendence of physical reality and the suffering that's connected to that. And so therefore, again, the good in Buddhism is this the end of suffering. It's the transcendence of suffering to break out of that. And of course, that's the concept of nirvana. The last tradition that we'll look at here is what I added in here, which is New Age Individualism. And this is something that's modern to our modern society. I'll move this up here so that my face is not in the way. But what we have is the foundation of New Age Individualism is, of course, and this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think if you look at all the various teachings that are going out there, you'll see why it is that this individualist New Age teaching fits very, very well with our modern consumer society, where the foundation of it is, of course, me, what I think, what I experience, what my feelings are. It's always unique. I'm perfectly unique. My identity can shift and change however I want it to be. And I'm always right because I'm the sole arbiter of truth. And you have your truth, I have my truth, and our truths will never be the same. And that's exactly how it's supposed to be. And it can never be different. There's no real need for any real, we can just be, the only thing we can be shared about is that we're all completely different or something like that. So what is the universe? What exists? Well, at the end of the day, it's me. And what I am becomes lifted up to the highest possible level, almost of deification. And so that's why I say with anthropology, then what is man? Well, man is, I'm the definer of what man is. It's just me. I'm unique. I'm perfectly, there's no shared definition of man. But what then happens is that because the I is so central, then it gets lifted up to take the place of a god, really, where the self becomes the thing that becomes worshipped. And so the good is just all about self-realization. There's this idea that what I am is this perfect, essence inside, and I just have to let that out and let it be manifested in reality, and then everything will be perfect and will be solved. So that is the idea of New Age individualism and the way that it is realized. So the next table I have then is typical problems. So these are problems that all human beings will face at some time in their life, and how these different approaches deal with them in their philosophy and in their teachings. And I think I've added New Age individualism on this table as well, so hopefully that'll pop up when I get to the end of the presentation. So first of all, with the secular approach, how do we deal with suffering and death? Well, a very common thread throughout all wisdom literature is that life on the focus of it and without a transcendent ideal is just vanity and emptiness and pain and suffering. This is, of course, what Buddhism is built on, these kinds of insights. But it's an inherent aspect of reality. It's something that I only started realizing and seeing probably after I turned about 35 years of age or something like that. I think we're living in a society which gives us space to avoid these kinds of thoughts for longer and longer time. People don't need to grow up and mature and become adults. So we're getting better and better, or we've become better. We've created such a comfortable, abundant society as far as material needs is concerned that we can actually avoid having to think about death and suffering for a very long time. But at some point, death is probably the most real thing there is. And I think at some point time in their life, most people or all people are confronted with death and need to deal with it as well. And I think that's why we're increasingly seeing a breakdown of this secular worldview as well. But that is the only approach that the secular worldview can really deal with the suffering and death question. We see how death is kind of like removed away from the public sphere. I've just been through some military first aid training where we were confronted with very violent scenes of pain and suffering and possible death, and seeing how people have never had to be confronted with that kind of situation before and how they react in kind of shutting down and paralysis and things like that. It was quite clear that it's something that we're very protected from a lot of the time in our modern society. What do we have faith in the secular worldview? Well, we have faith in science and the facts. The problem with this, of course, is that when we look at reality, then there's really just, and science increasingly recognizes this itself, is that there's just like a seething chaos of possibility and potential. Just looking at, like my coffee cup and the coffee inside it, there's so much detail and so much information there. So the idea that it's like, well, which facts is it that we're looking at? The answer, of course, to that is that, well, there has to be a story. There has to be a personal story, or a kind of container, a perspective, an identity that determines which facts it is that we're looking at. And so in the scientific worldview, often science is driven by ideals of efficiency and rationality, and a kind of Western mindset of rationality, which determines what it is that we look at. Of course, most people have this sense that there is something transcendent in existence. And in the secular scientific worldview, we don't really talk about or focus on the transcendent at all. We only can really talk about the material part of existence, which is, of course, the natural place for science to be as well. The problem is that when we try and describe transcendent realities with science, that's when issues come in, of course, when people try and do that. When we look at the origin of evil, most people experience there is evil in the world. Terrible things happen. Right now we have a war happening on the edges of Europe. Then the best explanation we have from science is that trauma and injustice are the reason that we can have evil things happening and bad people doing bad things. So if we can just kind of resolve all the trauma and the injustice, then everything's going to be fine. Of course, this has proven again and again not to necessarily work. It seems like there is a deeper cause of evil in the world. And then lastly, we have the question, what's the point of it all? So this is the problem of nihilism. And in a human life, then at some point we need to understand, like, why am I here? What's it all about? Especially when one is faced with collapse or pain or severe suffering, and that's how we deal with suffering and death. And the real closest answer we can get from a secular worldview is that you have to find an ideology that can kind of give some kind of explanation. And so there's a broad range of ideologies, especially political ideologies, that are increasingly used by different people. So, but that's the only way to find a story that one can use to give an explanation of why we're all here. Then we're going to look at the Christian worldview. So the Christian approach to suffering and death is to embrace it. Of course, this is best illustrated by the life of Christ, who willingly could have he could have avoided any kind of suffering or pain for himself, but he willingly gave himself up to be betrayed by his friends and, beaten and whipped and crown of thorns, carried his own cross, and then crucified, hung up on a cross and left and killed in that way. A full embracing of death. and suffering as fully as possible, as the most powerful being in existence, the embodiment of the most powerful being in existence. So it was a fully voluntary embracing of suffering and death as an expression of love, and then the demonstration of how that, by giving himself over to the Romans, the biggest civilization that ever existed, the most powerful civilization, he, in the process of 300 years, actually conquered the Roman civilization and took it over, one can say, and has become the most powerful figure in human history ever to have existed, through this act of embracing of suffering and death. So in that way, kind of, one could say in a real way, just illustrating how actually love conquers death in some way. So again, when it comes to when we have faith, what do we put our faith in as a Christian? Well, the faith is in Jesus Christ. It's in the person of Jesus Christ, who of course, one knows through the scriptures, through the teachings of the church, and through the practices that are described in the church, as well as kind of like there's this illustration of the ladder between, which Jacob saw in a vision of Christ being the ladder between heaven and earth, which kind of brings those two things together. And so that goes into the next column, which is the material and the transcendent, because Christ is then, as the incarnation of God, he is what brings together every aspect of the highest of the high and the lowest of the low into one hypostasis. So it brings all of those things together. The origin of evil in Christianity is rebellion. You have the story of the Satan, who was the angel of light, the Lucifer, who then he saw himself as equal to God, or wanted to put himself above God, and so rebelled therefore. And again, human beings were given, as opposed to animals. Animals don't have any idea of good and evil, but human beings, we have this innate sense of things being right and wrong, and we have free will. So the idea in Christianity is that humans are given the opportunity to choose either to draw closer to God or to go against it and go against him. And so drawing closer to God creates peace and harmony and the establishment of the kingdom of heaven on earth. And the rejection of God is what causes evil. It's rebellion against God that does that. What's the point of it all? Well, in Christianity is theosis. It is the full realization of the human person as created in the image of God. And so that's seen in a very real way, especially in Orthodox theology, that it's a becoming of one with God, even within this lifetime, as one sees in the examples of Christian saints who've been living throughout the ages. We then have the Buddhist tradition, where the dealing with suffering and death is through transcendence. So one should realize the illusion of suffering and death, and thereby be able to just be able to transcend it. One has faith in the tradition. So there's been, it's not necessarily so much in the person of the Buddha, but in the practices that he's been put in, that one puts one's faith. And I think this is why you'll see a lot of the time Buddhism is sometimes much more easily accessible to the secular types, because there's just a thing you have to do. And so you're not called upon to believe in a person, you're just called upon to believe in a tradition or in a practice that has obviously scientifically provable benefits to be done as well. I think Christians could learn a little bit from this as well, in that Christianity has often been too much emphasis being placed on Christianity being a set of ideas that you need to adopt these ideas or beliefs. And once you adopt these ideas and beliefs, then you've become a Christian. Whereas I think the early church and a more correct understanding of Christianity is more that, again, the exact same Buddhism, it's a set of practices that one lives in your life and does. It's concrete actions that you're doing. But yeah, to a higher degree, those practices are dependent on a faith in the person of Jesus Christ as the God-man, as opposed to just faith in a practice that other people have been doing as well. I think it's fair to say, and I've checked this with several Buddhists, especially Zen Buddhists, they would agree with me that there is a transcendent focus to Buddhism. So there's a higher focus on the transcendence rather than material reality. And I think it's represented often by, the core Buddhist practice, of course, is sitting in silent meditation by yourself and meditating often on emptiness or something like that, or whatever it is. The next one is the origin of evil in Buddhism is really delusion. It's a misunderstanding of the way things really are. It's believing in the wheel of samsara and not seeing the illusion of it all. And so by transcending these delusions, by seeing through them, then one is able to reach this point of nirvana, according to the Buddhist tradition. Lastly, we have the New Age tradition. This is New Age Individualism. I've really, and so again, I'm not very kind, I guess, to this, but this is very much based on what I've seen and experienced, is that there is an attempt to often distract oneself with hedonistic practices. So often you'll see lots of psychedelics and crazy sexual practices and stuff like that within this New Age world. Their retreats will often be people just hooking up left, right, and center, and lots of really chaotic lifestyles that are given free flow. Just like, be yourself, do whatever you feel like it. It's also of course, the first commandment of Satanism. Satanism is do what thou wilt, which is often taken up by the New Age people as saying, just believe in yourself and, don't let society stop you and all this kind of stuff. So what do we have faith in? Well, we have faith in ourself. I am the source of truth. I am the source of light. I am the source of everything good. So I just need to let it all out, and then everything's going to be great. And a large part of our society is also facilitating that to a large degree as well. So faith in oneself. Of course, there's also this transcendent focus. So a lot of New Age practitioners will often have a very chaotic personal life, but just by kind of seeing like the bigger picture, there's this spiritual bypassing that leads one to not really have any insight into the real problems and chaos of one's own life. Then there can all be kinds of things about different explanations of the origin of evil. But again, I think trauma and injustice are two key ones. There's also this illusion thing, is that evil is really just an illusion, and especially in these kind of like more Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhism approaches, then a lot of the time evil is just seen as an illusion. And so whatever I do, my action should never be judged by the standards. And so you have people, Buddhist or not Buddhist, but various gurus who do crazy, weird stuff that's obviously very aggressive and very selfish, but they somehow make it like, no, this is just tantric teaching, where they're very abusive and have sex with students and all that kind of stuff as well. The point of the New Age traditions, I would say, is self-deification. So it's really to take the place of God oneself. Of course, those you might recognize the Lucifer's example of wanting to take the place of God. But I'd say this is pretty much exactly the same thing that we're seeing here in the New Age world. Is it's about seeing that you are God yourself, or you are the source of light and truth and goodness, and so that you just need to realize that, and then everything's going to be great. So that was what I had to say about these 4 different traditions, and I hope that that's been useful for you. I'll say it's really important as you go into meditation, into a contemplative practice, that you contend with these traditions, you understand where they're coming from, and that you take them seriously. I think John Vervaeke, in a conversation I had with him, he said that if you think you can just be outside of a tradition, then you're just basically adopting the tradition of the Enlightenment, which is this secular, materialist only tradition. That's the one that that our society runs on. It's what your schooling trained you in. And so you're going to really come to some kind of barrier with that at some point. John Vervaeke said, it's when the weird stuff happens, that's when you need to start looking deeper as well. And what happens is that one does encounter inexplicable, various either beings or occurrences or transcendent experiences somehow through tradition, through meditation, And that's when one needs to, that's when one has the opportunity to really use, you need to use some tradition to try and frame these things. Otherwise, you risk going down into the New Age tradition yourself. So, hope you found that useful. And please let me know if you have any comments or questions. And I'm sure that I can build out this understanding even more in a future version. So thanks very much.